it's a big topic, property rights. It's obviously something that socialists would like to abolish, in the sense that private property rights, at the very least, we're talking about means of production. Even regular normies, consequentialist utilitarians want to tone down property rights, otherwise they cannot tax you. So the discussion around property rights is a very relevant thing. And let's start with why it is important. And the way that I like to um, explain it is that I'd like to break it down into two different categories, or two different focuses, I suppose. One is for individuals, and one one is from a society point of view. And when I say society, I don't mean like in a utilitarian sense. I mean like for a flourishing society. Let's make it a bit nicer. So let's start on the individual side. Um, so basically, the idea of individual rights, I'm just explaining it here, is that you use your labor and creativity, let's say, and you create something, and then you basically you create some property, and then you basically own and control it. And so property ownership. And that's pretty much like hold on. Oh, there we go. That's pretty much the idea. You created something of value. You put your work, I wouldn't say put your work into something necessarily, but you use your labor, your creativity, you create something of value, and you should be allowed to keep that. Some people look at it as in you put your labor into something in the land, into the earth, and then you homesteaded it, or even if you took like a stick and you altered it in a particular way into like a fishing pole or something like that, then the land plus your work did it. But here I'm just defining it in the more objectivist way, where you use your labor and creativity. And because of this particular structure, it forms. So in a particular sense, this is a way for us to survive. So essentially, this, if we can control our, if we can own our own property, then we can have control over the mechanism in which we survive. If we go fishing or something, and we get to keep our fish, or if we make a machine that can, I don't know, make fishing poles faster, then that is sort of like a meme for us to a means for us to survive. And this sort of mechanism allows us to survive based on our labor and creativity. And once we have this in place, we have an incentive. Hold on, actually. We have an incentive that basically rewards our efforts, or based on our effort, we have an incentive to how can I say this? Because we're allowed to keep what we created, we have an incentive to do more things now that we have this sort of structure. So we have an incentive to create more things in the future. We have an incentive to innovate, and we have an incentive to expand our production, because we will get to keep it. So it is safe. It is protected by the state. No ANCAP comments, please. This is anti-socialist, not no anti-ANCAP. And all these things flow from having property rights. In addition, if we own something within like a more financial sense, we can make investments based on collateral. So hold on. So we can say, here is our house, or is a plot of land. I want to go to the bank and I want to borrow money. And if they say, well, can you put some sort of collateral? Say, well, I can put my land or my house, and then I can use that investment from the bank to expand production. So it's very relevant, and especially in poorer countries where people, like, for example, if it's, they don't have, how can I say this? Like the property rights aren't very good in some countries in the world. It's not like in the Western world where everything is like a well-oiled machine in terms of bureaucracy, sort of. But in some places, it is not, and you can have people, like poor people, living off land that they lived off their parents and grandparents, but it's not under anyone's name. Once it becomes under their name, so this is your land because you've worked in it for a very long time and no one else has claimed it, they have access to these sorts of investment, to these sorts of financial, formal financial parts of the economy. But just skipping over that for a second, so again, we have for the individual, they use their labor and creativity, they can create something which they can then own because the state protects those rights, which gives them an incentive to create, innovate, and expand production. So far, so good, I assume. And essentially, on the society stuff, sorry, my dog is attacking me. Sit here. On the society stuff, we have two sorts of mechanism that comes from property rights. One is trade. Trade is important. And one is dispute resolution. Which we'll do here quickly. And sorry, so without property rights, you simply cannot trade. You don't have the right to trade something. I mean, if it's like before property rights and people just own something and no one else is taking it away from them by force, then it's kind of like 9/10 it's theirs because they're just holding on to it. But if you have the government to instate property rights, you can then trade things, and also trade things like contracts and stuff like that. Like if you can't set up contracts without having property rights, so it's very relevant for trading in society. And also property rights for dispute resolution. If someone has a claim to some property or it's unclear who owns what, then the dispute resolution will be who actually owns something, and then once they decide that the dispute is resolved. But both of these things are important to society. Why? Because if you have mechanisms to dispute resolutions, obviously it leads to a more peaceful society. And if you have trade, it also leads to a more peaceful society. Because now people have a mechanism to interact in a cooperative, peaceful way. And in addition, you also have a prosperous society. Oh. I'm making a spelling mistake, someone let me know. And that is with trade. Sorry. Ooh. And also incentives also makes a prosperous society. Okay, let's do like a quick summary. So what, on the one hand, they are moral. Why are they moral? Because it allows man, it's like sort of man's means of survival, not reason in a way, but you can keep the labor that you've done, and this allows you to help you survive. No one else can take away things from you, and and use force on you, that is removed, and that is why property rights are moral. And we've already discussed that in terms of societies, it leads to peaceful and prosperous societies. So there's a moral and a practical, as we say in objectivism. There's a moral and a practical. So the moral you've explained, the practical you've explained. We can go quickly about incentives, and this is more of an argument for a debate. So if, for example, I'm not allowed to keep my property, and bear in mind some people will say private or personal property, but let's say in general I'm not allowed to keep my property, so why would I produce any property if I'm not allowed to keep it? It doesn't make any sense. So I don't have the incentive to make anything if I'm not allowed to keep it, if someone else can just take it away from me. Or let's say my time would be taken up protecting the stuff that I make, instead of me just making stuff and confident that they won't be taken away from me. And if people don't have incentive to produce, then society will not be prosperous, will have shortages, and it may not be peaceful, because people will have to start fighting over who protects what. So we can say, for example, it reduces conflict, which is the original. This is a very important point. The original idea is before we had civilized societies, people, let's say, guarded their territory, or even if you take animals, like they'll guard their territory, they won't let other animals come in, they'll start fighting them. You can't do that in a civilization. Everyone will just be like isolated in their own little areas, and you won't be able to I'll see if at the end if I can answer. So people basically, the history of property rights, in a sense, and it's a very long history. You had property rights. It's very long ago. You had property rights like in 1700 BC already in Mesopotamia, and the Code of Hammurabi. So it's very, very old, or at least we know that they had it because they inscribed it on some sort of large rock or large obelisk. I'm not sure. But the idea of property rights is to resolve conflicts, that people won't fight between them. There'll be some sort of agreement that this is yours and that is someone else's. And if there isn't an agreement, if there's some sort of dispute, then a king or a court would settle the dispute instead of people killing each other. That's kind of the idea. So in additional to that, moving a little on, you can say that property rights, like this is a minor point technically, but encourages respect. So there's actually a few things that property rights kind of instill in a society. You can say respect. You can say this is more for other elements, like when you have property rights, you will learn to respect other people's stuff. You're not going to take it, you're not going to steal it, or if you are, then you're not respecting it. But for most of society, there's a sort of ethic in the culture that you start respecting other people's property, and in a sense other people to some degree. So that's like a minor point. Like we mentioned that before property rights there was no civilization, or civilization is like you needed property rights as a precursor to civilization. Something that a lot of people know, but property rights restrains government. Seneca had a saying in Latin. I don't really know it by heart, but the king controls, but the people own. So basically, and this is also relevant to England, the king had to get money from the lords, the aristocrats, and people who owned houses, like had more than 40 shillings. I'm not exactly sure, but basically the king needed the people, or the wealthy, or the like medium and above wealthy people, and he was restrained by them. So he was in control of the kingdom, but he had to appease and request money from the people who had money, especially if the king's treasury was low, or if they wanted to if the king wanted to engage in a war with another country, he had to get their permission or their agreement to do those kind of things. It's very relevant even today. If you have governments that need taxes from the people, need property from the people to do stuff, they won't go overboard, they won't be as dictatorial. But if you have governments, for example in the Middle East, that the government owns the oil revenue from something, then the government has very little interest in what the people care, and they have like their own isolated kind of fiefdom, and they could oppress the people as long as let's say the oil of the company, which could be 80% of all the GDP, as long as the oil keeps flowing, they can essentially do what they like. They don't have to please or help anyone. To some degree, property rights can also save the environment. You have, it's like a minor point really, but you can have either people who want to conserve the rainforest, they can buy land and just do nothing with it, or you could say that through like free market mechanisms, well, if you had free markets, then people would rely on property rights more to resolve the issue like pollution, because if you dump waste on my backyard, then I can sue you. So these kinds of property rights help with those kinds of things. And you can say, for example, this is actually relevant. Environmentalism, by the way, is a huge issue in any of these sorts of debates. It's always going to come up, and it's always going to come up in a way that you need government for this reason. So keep in mind that if you are going to do these sorts of debates, that environmentalism will come up all the time. Again, in a sense that you need government for this. But I mean, in the case of property rights, you're still essentially using the government. You're just not using the government in like a sort of economic kind of negative externality kind of sense. You're using it as a sort of property rights, a dispute resolution of property rights. And in general, I can just throw some details out there. The USSR, which is, a country at the time, a socialist country that had no property rights or private property rights, had huge environmental issues, huge ecocides. There's a book called Ecocide in USSR. They killed all the fish in a particular lake, had drained the Aral Sea in Kazakhstan almost completely. In East Germany, there was 20 times more pollution than in the air, not like CO2, but like you can feel the pollution in the air kind of pollution, than West Germany. So this, and even if you take like today, like government entities that aren't in the US, that aren't going to be told by the EPA what to do because they're in the same government necessarily, then even those pollute a lot. For example, the US government, or specifically the military, pollutes more than 140 countries combined. So people don't really realize that property rights are something that's very relevant to this point. And the last one is that property right helps the poor get rich. Help the poor get rich. What do I mean? So in Peru, there was a man called Hernando de Soto in the late 80s that said that there are lots of poor people in Peru. They don't have property rights to, they're all farmers. They don't have property rights to the land they're farming. And we need to give them property rights to this land, even though it takes like 260 days to do this per application or something like that. And if you give them something, if you give them property rights, then they could again they will have something that belongs to them. They can also then be part of the formal economy, and they can also use financial institutions to take out loans and grow. And it was very relevant, and it's important to mention because specifically there was at the time there was a communist party called the Shining Path, and this particular issue with property rights for the poor was able to get the poor to fight the communist Shining Path and subdue them, even though they bombed the capital and they bombed that guy who suggested this to the government. But yeah, it's important to mention. So I'll again take a break now for some questions. I see I have some. So people against foreign ownership, like Asians buying apartments in cities as a sort of investment. I think on the whole, I'm not against that because I believe that sort of investment also helps encourage development for like large apartment blocks. I am aware that people say that, or in London, for example, where at night you can see buildings with only like a few lights, like tall buildings, sorry, with only like a few lights open. But I think once that was limited, there was less houses being built. So overall negative. I'll have to consult the numbers, but in general, I would say that you can't really have a NIMBYism or like privileged people there or people who are not there yet. I would say that if people want to dump money into your economy, then let them. How do you answer the argument that capitalism needs the exploitation? I am actually going to get to that. Yep, going to get to all of that. All those socialist arguments next. Exploitation, inequality, environmental destruction I actually kind of answered now. Lack of democracy. I'm not sure I'll do the last two here. I'll try. Okay, hold on a second. Okay. So let's move on to the questions I just got, but I was preparing those in advance. Okay. So let's go here. So these are now let's focus on the attacks on property rights. So we have like a good kind of understanding more or less. We had the explanations to what property rights are in a certain way of looking at it from an individual's point of view and from a societal point of view. A few like comments and points on property rights just to get like a flavor for everything. So we're primed, we have an understanding of it, I hope. Let's talk about the actual how socialists attack it and how we can attack back. Aristotle, are you using ChatGPT or is it my imagination? It has a flavor to it that looks familiar. Okay, so basically the idea that we are now gonna like put on our socialist cap and pretend we're socialists and complain about property rights. So we're gonna say that a capitalist, let's see here, what am I doing? Capitalist and a worker, or workers even, and the evil capitalist uses private property rights to then force the worker, then exploit the worker. Exploit the worker, and by exploiting the worker then produces labor and produces from that labor there is a profit. We like profit. Hold on. They extract profit using a plier through the nose, and then the profit goes back to the capitalist. And you can say the same thing. So this sort of cycle, like the Because of private property rights, the capitalist has a factory, has a means of production, the worker does not. And he has to agree, so he's forced. He's forced to agree to this arrangement. It's not voluntary. Let's do... And he's doing that because he needs to survive. He has no access to means of production himself. This is a typical socialist argument. He has no access to the means of production himself. He doesn't... that are protected by property rights from the evil government who is also owned by the capitalists. And he's forced to agree just so that the capitalist again could extract profits from him and get richer. And so the question is like, so in order to survive, and how can I say this? He has a lack of freedom as a result of this, and this is an important point because socialists use the concept of freedom in this context, or let's say he has a lack of control over his environment, and because the capitalists use property rights to restrict access to the means of production. So he doesn't have access to it, and he doesn't have enough money, enough capital to buy means of production. Then he has to have an arrangement with someone who does. In addition, because the capitalist has taken this profit, we now have as a result wealth inequality or income inequality. I'm not sure I did spell that right. Equal ET. And in addition to having wealth inequality, the capitalist also has political power now because he can basically control the state who protect property rights. And as a result, we have the worst thing ever, hierarchies. Right? That's evil. We don't like hierarchies. Two other points before I continue. One is because we have profit, if we want to increase profits, we have to cut costs. Right? That's the only way to increase profits. And how do we cut costs? We make unsafe worker conditions, don't we? Conditions. Yeah, and we also do low wages. I mean, obviously workers are the most expensive element, so we have to cut wages as much as possible to make a profit as much as possible. And by the way, this sort of like exploitative kind of cycle here, we can also say it's the same with rent, or it's not far from. So when you have a landlord, it's essentially you're essentially doing the same activity. You're exploiting the worker. The worker has to work, and you're not doing anything of value. The landlord isn't doing anything of value just because they bought a house that they themselves didn't build. Someone else built it. They just had the capital, and now the worker has to work and pay off the landlord or the capitalist and the money. So it's the concept of rent. It's the concept of that the workers or the regular citizens don't have access to this capital, and therefore they're out of the loop in general, and they'll always be poor while the capital will incrementally get rich. Is that good so far? Have I depressed you, or do you think I missed a particular element from the socialist, or have I covered everything? Thumbs up in chat. Great. So basically, there's a few ways to counter it, although I will ask people in the audience to give their own opinion here. But the problem with this sort of cycle is that it focuses on a narrow picture, and in general, socialists and people and progressives or consequentialists, utilitarians, Actually, no, I'm not just socialists in general will focus on a narrow picture and basically take a half truth and blow it up. What do I mean? Let's see what actually happens. So you have the employer and you have the employees. Both of these will be yellow because I said so. And they trade. Right? And with trade, both have a sort of benefit. Each trade is essentially mutually beneficial. You won't take a trade that you lose money from. And the employee, for example, could have several things that he needs to take care of or earn money for the reason. So one is, for example, nature. Nature forces us to eat, and this is important to mention because it's not the case that the capitalist is forcing you to eat. It's nature that's forcing you to eat and drink and have shelter and stuff like that. It could be family, like the employee could have families taking care of him and he needs to work for that, or he could work for retirement. One day he wants to retire and not work anymore, and he wants to save money for that reason. And an employer also isn't the boss of everything. They have customers, that they answer to. They have shareholders that they answer to. And they have regulators that they answer to, don't they? So everyone has like a sort of ecosystem where they all have something that they are, how do I say, they all need to answer to. No one is the boss of anything, but from a socialist, what they see is this. Let's see if I can do this. So this would be what the socialists focus on. Just this part, that the employer gets the benefit, and it doesn't focus on the employee gets any benefit. It doesn't focus on anything that the employer has to answer to, or the capitalist has to answer to, or the owner of the company has to answer to. And we have this very narrow view of what is happening, and it seems to be that because of this like sort of approach is that surplus value, that is that this is not fair because they're missing the bigger picture. What is being missed here, for example, is that an entrepreneur, took a risk, tried to see there's some kind of something missing in the market, some sort of niche is missing in the market. They said, I can fill this niche. They did some research, or they looked around and they developed a product or service for this niche that they thought was missing in the market. They got some loans, they remortgaged their house, they took some money from their parents, and they started something. And then after a while, it passed the first year, it passed the second year, and now they're looking to hire people. Now, in the meantime, 9 other businesses have failed, or 6 other businesses have failed, and 3 other businesses are making money, but not enough to hire anyone. Like they're just, like a lifestyle, but they're just meeting enough to pay for the owner's lifestyle. And 1 out of 10 was able to survive past 2 years, maybe even all the way up to 5, but certainly most die out after 11 or 15. And they've made a company, and now they're in a position to hire employees. And that all that sort of risk taking and raising capital and the ability to determine what is missing in the market, innovate some sort of solution for that, all that is missing. The destruction of the other 9 companies is missing. All the employees see is they're working and the manager is making money. Typically, in addition, business owners, like they pay when they're just starting out. Typically, they pay everyone else a salary and they pay themselves last. So they'll only draw a salary after a year or 2 years. They'll draw a salary last once they start being profitable, or they even to a point where if they're unable to pay the salaries, they'll go into credit card debt to be able to pay the salaries of the employees. But all that is missing from this kind of picture. The mechanism of trade is where you take two individuals, like in the case here where we have an employer and employee, and they're both self-interested, and they both want the best for themselves. And the idea of a trade is the mechanism of trade. You take two people that are self-interested, and you put them in a sort of environment where to serve their self-interest, they would engage in the trade. Trade would be mutually beneficial for both of them, but each will uh, will benefit selfishly. And the mechanism of trade is what in a society is what's called the harmony of interest. So when you have this mechanism again, and everyone's self-interested, but through trade you have a harmony of interest, and everyone's interest is put together, and then society itself is more prosperous through this mechanism of harmony of interest. Now, what does it mean from a games theory point of view? That if you have an employer and employee, so if you have two people trading, then both people get a benefit in a game theory. Now, if you have a situation where someone sacrifices something, yeah, so for example, someone is forced to sacrifice, is forced to give all their money to charity or most of the money to well, yeah. So right, right. So just for the benefit for the benefit of other people, let me just finish for the benefit. So if you have a situation where you have a sacrifice, then again you have like a zero sum game. Someone is benefiting and someone is losing. So if you have a situation where it's a very religious society and everyone's encouraged to donate everything they have to someone more needy, then you have a one and a zero, or one or a minus one. Someone lost and someone gained. You have a zero sum society. Whereas if you have a society with trade and harmony of interest, you have a positive sum society. The wealth grows over time, and if you do like these millions and billions of interactions where both people benefit in a society, then the society itself grows and you have economic growth. But if you have a situation where it's just stuff moves from one person to another and there's no like it's a zero sum game, some person wins, some person loses, then you have like a stagnant and or shrinking society. If you consider that the thing that is moved from one person to another gets consumed by the one person, like they eat the resources, and you're not making much more. Now so that's in terms of the Nash equilibrium and the harmony of interest. Now in terms of oligopolies specifically, I'm not sure if this is in reality not in a game theory. No, I'll it's a common topic. So what was I thinking? I had a thing. So in general, the barriers to entry that restrict the number of people entering a particular industry is set by government through regulation. They increase the barrier to entry. That so I know, I'm saying in general, not necessarily, but in general. You can have a situation where you do need like a lot of capital, X, Y, and Z, but over time, bear in mind that we do have situations where through innovations those barriers to entry go down. Typically, this is true. Now, if you have like a sort of industry, and I'm talking like economics now, if you have a sort of industry where there's a high profit margin to be made, and everyone in that industry is had an agreement. So okay, before I go to the cartel, so let's say you have a monopoly in a market, and they have a very high profit rate because no one else is competing. Then you're basically signaling to another company to come in and compete. And once they're there, and let's say they have a high barrier to entry and they need to raise a lot of capital to get into that market to then compete. If you have that, once they've committed all that capital, you have a competitor for life now. They will always have to be there because they've already committed. And in a lot of cases, like for example, this is in Ayn Rand's Virtue of Selfishness. You had a Canadian company, 50 years ago, or even you had a Canadian company that sold copper, had a lot of access to copper, but the prices they sold it at were not very high as to not incentivize a competitor to get into the market. So just the threat of it sometimes makes monopolies not charge a high price. Now let's specifically cartels, where you have or oligopolies, we have an agreement between companies to fix the price or not raise the price beyond a particular amount. Out of many cartels, they don't last very long. Typically through history, and this is work by Murray Rothbard, one or two of the people in the cartel, they want to, it's not convenient for them, they do something where they break the agreement, but like the first break is like they don't want to tell anyone, it's just a one-off thing, and then over time the thing breaks. So with cartels, there's pressure on, I had a better way of phrasing this, I forgot what there's pressure inside the cartel to break up, the pressure outside the cartel to break up from, let's say, the market, and consistently over time those things break up. Typically they last longer if the government of any country is involved in keeping the cartel around. So there was a diamond cartel called De Beers that was around for 85 years, but because they owned, because the government in one of the countries in Africa had like 15% shares in the company. But typically cartels are just very difficult to maintain, because the pressures from the inside and the pressures from the outside the market coming in, meaning like, competition, innovations, different requirements. Like, again, companies don't last forever. Some companies, like average company dies around 11 years. S&P companies die around on average 15 years. So it's not like, there's all sorts of pressures and creative destruction that happens in the markets. But I hope that answered your question.